Chapter 089 Victory. It was a peaceful summer day in the great northern forest. The vegetation was vibrantly green and thriving. Colorful flowers covered the forest meadows. The songbirds were seemingly competing to see which one of them was louder and shriller than the next, and strange insects were flying through the air. While the vast expanse of trees that covered the northern portion of the Altasian continent was usually portrayed as a dark and foreboding place, crawling with dangerous monsters and hidden dangers, the truth is that the area could be quite beautiful and breathtaking. One just had to be strong enough to survive the challenges and travel the land unchecked. Zorian, Tivan and Kale were definitely strong enough. Not just because Zorian was present in the group, either. Tivan and Kale had gone through 5 whole loops by now, each of which included additional time in the black rooms. They'd had nearly an entire year to improve their magic, backed by nearly unlimited resources and top-tier tutors. Even Kale, who spent most of that time focusing on alchemy, was now capable of at least defending himself from common threats. As for Taven, she was a combat magic specialist to begin with. Her power was probably equal to an average professional combat mage at this point. She even had real combat experience, since she insisted on fighting the Evasan invaders at the end of every restart and often participated in minor battles that Damon's team stumbled upon while exploring Blantyre. Even if Zorian decided to stand back and let the other two fend for themselves, there was very little in the forest around them that could threaten them. Currently, the three of them were resting on a large boulder in one of the forest clearings and playing a game of cards. It was just something to pass the time while they rested their feet. They had been wandering the forest for hours before stumbling upon the clearing, and it looked so perfect for a temporary camp they decided to take a bit of a break. They didn't intend to stay here for very long. As Zorian pondered his next move, he felt Taven subtly try to take a peek at his cards with a spying spell. Zorian was proud for her for expanding her horizons beyond flashy combat magic, but that didn't stop him from reflexively crushing her magic into nothingness before giving her a knowing smile. She pouted for a moment, before remembering she was supposed to act like she didn't know anything and schooling her expression into one of indifference. Kale silently observed the scene from the side before shaking his head in amusement, probably guessing what had happened. Zorian suspected Tivan had tried to use the same trick on Kale as well, though he had no idea if the Morlunk boy had managed to stop her, or even noticed her cheating. Then again, Kale didn't seem to take the card game very seriously. He seemed to be playing mindlessly, uncaring of how likely he is to win. Zorian supposed this sort of attitude made perfect sense, since this was supposed to be just a nice relaxing game with no stakes, but it faintly annoyed him anyway. Zorian himself didn't try to cheat, of course. That would suck the joy out of the whole activity, since it would be so trivial for him to succeed. He simply immersed himself in the game while listening to the sounds of the wilderness around them. His legs throbbed in pain, unused to the level of activity he was engaging in, but he had kind of gotten used to that by now. Even with the aid of potions and mind magic, the beginning of every restart involved Zorian being in a constant state of dull pain because he lived far more actively than he had before the time loop. Hopefully that wouldn't have any long-term mental effects on him once he was out of the time loop. He was broken out of his thoughts by a loud crunching sound. Looking to the side, he saw Kale with a large yellow root stuffed in his mouth. Taven gave Kale a strange, possibly disapproving look. "What?" Kale complained, chewing loudly. The sound it produced reminded Zorian of someone eating a raw carrot. "How can you eat that thing?" she asked him. "It's really tasty," he told her matter-of-factly. "It's a wild root you washed in a nearby river," she protested. "That cannot possibly be safe or hygienic. Plus, I can smell it from here and it doesn't smell like something you should be eating." Kale gave her a challenging look before biting into the root again and chewing even louder. Zorian pretended to study his cards while inwardly chuckling in amusement. Personally, he wasn't worried about Kale in the slightest. Although the Morlock was the weakest of the three in terms of combat strength, he was the person who was most at home in the forest. He had been working and living in this very environment ever since he was a child, and doubtlessly knew exactly what was safe to eat and how. Tivan had gotten relatively close to Kale after they had both received a temporary marker, since the two of them were arguably the closest in age and relative skill among the new loopers, so she probably knew that too. Thus, she simply threw her hands in the air with a huff, accidentally showing them a glimpse of the cards she was holding, and dropped the issue. Zorian took note of her cards and changed his tactics accordingly. This wasn't cheating, of course. Taking advantage of your opponent's mistakes was only natural. It wasn't his problem that he could memorize her entire hand flawlessly after seeing it for only a fraction of a second. After another 15 minutes of chatting, playing cards, eating roots and berries and lazing around, the three of them reluctantly decided to move on. After all, this whole expedition originated from Kale's desire to search for rare alchemical ingredients in the depths of the Great Northern Forest. This wasn't really some critical task that had to be done, and the three of them were mostly using it as an excuse to relax and socialize, but they did intend to seriously search for things Kale was after. For the next half an hour or so, Zorian followed after Kale, casting divination after divination and occasionally taking over the minds of forest birds in order to scout the area around them. Taven also utilized divinations, having achieved some measure of expertise in the field over the various restarts, while Kale mostly relied on his own two eyes. Considering his extensive experience in searching for magical plants, however, he probably still saw and understood far more than Zorian and Taven did. Every once in a while the Morlock boy would inspect some random stump or boulder, occasionally picking up some other magical plant that wasn't on their list, but which he apparently also considered worthwhile, and occasionally just stared at them meaningfully while pondering some mysterious issue. The backpacks the three of them wore had all been made by Zorian, and were considerably larger on the inside than they appeared, but Zorian estimated Kale's backpack was already starting to get full from the various plants, jars full of worms and beetles, and even some colorful stones that seemed pretty mundane to Zorian's eyes. Even if they failed to find the things they were searching for, Kale certainly intended to make the most out of this expedition, that's for sure. Relaxing times like these had become increasingly rare in these last 5 restarts. Everyone was constantly busy with something, whether it was following some plan, searching for things that could help them, experimenting with exotic magics, or simply training their skills. This was especially true in this particular restart, since this was the last restart for the temporary loopers. If they could not figure out a way to modify the temporary markers before the end of the restart, they would lose. Well, everything. Sure enough, eventually Kale and Taven could not help but bring up the issue that was constantly in the back of everyone's mind these days. "This is the end, isn't it?" Kale suddenly said. The other two gave him conflicted looks. There was no need to ask him what he meant by that. "Tell us honestly, Zorian. What are the chances we can figure out how to adjust our markers before this month runs out?" Kale continued, seeing how he had their attention. Zorian suppressed a sigh. Temporary markers. They had spent almost a year studying them, if one factored in the time spent in black rooms, and in that time they had made significant progress. They managed to map the general structure of the markers and figure out what many of the pieces did. They compared these markers to the larger, more complete markers embedded in Zack and Zorian. They placed and removed temporary markers on random people to test possible modifications and see what happened. They found out that, yes, The markers really did contain components made out of divine energies. And they also found a way to deal with that. Through several ruinously expensive deals with Quetzalcoatl and innumerable destroyed divine artifacts, they managed to create methods to detect and crudely manipulate strands of divine energy inside their markers. Not enough to manipulate them as they wished, but enough to tear out some portions of the structure and change how this divine foundation interacted with more normal magic that surrounded it. It wasn't enough. Despite their best efforts, the solution remained frustratingly out of reach. What bothered Zorian most about this was that he didn't think the problem was impossible. They were making good progress. He felt they were definitely on the right track. He felt that this was something that could definitely be solved in time. Could they figure out a way to prolong the temporary marker in one more restart? No. Not even 3 would be enough. But maybe if they had 5 or 6? If their soul magic was more developed. If they had easier access to the imperial crown resting on Quetzalcoatl's head. If they had learned how to sense divine energies sooner. If. No, Zorian finally admitted. There is no chance at all. All 3 of them walked in silence for a while. I am actually not that upset, Taven eventually said. The idea that I could just suddenly disappear at the end of the month was terrifying at first, but I've gotten used to it by now. I even died in one of the restarts. Zorian vividly remembered that one. Watching Taven get decapitated by a war troll was strangely upsetting, even though he knew she would be fine in the next restart. I mean, I don't want to disappear at the end of the month, Taven continued, but we've done everything we could and it was fun while it lasted. If this is how it has to be, then so be it. Indeed, Kale said. Besides, if I understood Zorian correctly, there are only 13 more restarts left at this point. A little more than a year. We're not losing all that much. Both of you talk like you think you're dead for sure, Zorian said. Have some faith, okay? Modifying the temporary markers is probably a failure, but the possibility of exiting the time loop still remains. This was our fallback plan if we couldn't modify the markers, remember? Oh. Taven perked up. That's still an option? Of course, said Zorian. What do you think we have been doing all this time? Well, I don't know, Taven said with a grin. That mean old witch keeps complaining about you wasting your time on distractions and taking too many breaks from your duties, so. Silver Lake thinks everyone should be a tireless golem except her, Zorian said with a derisive snort. It's not like she never takes any breaks or tinkers with new potions that have no connection to anything urgent. I thought that whole project was still shrouded in uncertainty, though, Kale pointed out. Well, yeah, Zorian reluctantly admitted. We have yet to actually try things, so it's all very theoretical. However, just because we are uncertain about some things doesn't mean the attempt is bound to fail. It's hard to put actual numbers on things, but I think there is at least a 70% chance that we could transport people's souls into the real world, and 30% or so that we could successfully open a dimensional bridge that would let us physically step out of the time loop. The two of them gave him complex looks that he could not interpret. It was a little hard to accurately discern their emotions these days, since they had both learned to protect their minds and emotions with unstructured mental defenses. In fact, this was something that all temporary loopers decided to invest time in, once they realized the extent of Zorian's mental powers. Even the ones that already had some level of unstructured mental defenses promptly decided they were insufficient and needed to be strengthened as much as possible. Zorian understood their reasoning. It was just like that old saying, trust your neighbor, but lock the door. Even if you trusted someone to be a moral and principled person, it was better not to tempt them with easy opportunities. Thus, he did not take such things against them. In fact, he encouraged it. Considering Yarania explicitly considered anyone with an unshielded mind fair game for psychic invasion, and that they were working closely with several groups of them, getting some level of mental protection was just plain common sense. If the only option to exit the time loop is to steal our original bodies from our past selves, I would rather stay here and forget everything, Kale said, shaking his head. Additionally, I only care about physically leaving if it allows me to take Kana with me. If not, I'd rather stay with her till the end. Zorian opened his mouth to say something, but then realized that it probably didn't matter that Kana doesn't have the temporary marker. If they physically left the time loop, every person was as good as any other. Would others also want to bring family members with them? That could get kind of complicated. I might have gone for the soul exit if it was actually an option, Taven said hesitantly. I mean, I feel sorry for old Taven, but let's get real here. She is kind of an idiot. Zorian's lips twitched into the beginning of a smile, but he suppressed it. As it is, I am not actually capable of taking this way out, Taven said. I'm not even good enough to survive Silver Lake's soul perception granting potion, never mind possessing my old body. So physically crossing over is the only option for me, really. Zorian nodded slowly. Truthfully, this was true for most people. People who had zero experience with soul magic would find it impossible to get good enough at it to survive the soul transferal and successfully possess their body. People who were well versed in soul magic, even before the time loop, would probably be annihilated by the originals if they tried to possess them. Aside from Zorian, only Kale, Xvim and Lucave had a good chance of pulling it off. And Xvim, much like Kale, had already ruled out the idea of stealing his own life away from himself. Physical exit is what we're aiming for, anyway, Zorian said. Transferring souls is more of a last resort than anything. Yes, but you admitted yourself that chances of success aren't too high. Not even a coin toss, Taven noted. So yeah, there is still hope. But it's nothing to get excited about. Hell, you're probably putting a positive spin on things to cheer us up. No, not at all, Zorian said, shaking his head. I was actually trying to be conservative with my estimates. I really think this could work. There is one thing that's been bothering me about all this, Kale said. We've spent a lot of time trying to figure out a way out of the time loop, but did you think about what we're going to do if we succeed with this? If we physically step into the outside world with all our skills and knowledge. Stop the invasion from destroying Cioria. Taven tried, raising her eyebrow at him. Well, yes. But what about afterwards? Kale asked. You have an entire life in front of you, but there is already someone living your life for you. Are you going to avoid your friends and family and set up a new life for yourself elsewhere? Or are you going to do your best to insert yourself into your old life and damn the consequences? What if someone reports you to the authorities and they come to drag you off? How would you explain your presence and identity? Taven squirmed uncomfortably. I don't know, she admitted, biting her lip. Honestly, I try not to think about things like that. I'm kind of impulsive, so even if I reach a resolution here, I will probably just break it when I actually get there. So there's no point. I can only hope I'll be able to figure something out when the time comes. I don't want to ruin the other Taven's life, but I don't know. What about you two? I'm fairly disconnected from most people, Kale shrugged. So long as I have my own Kana, everything is fine. I guess I would deliver my alchemy notes to my original and then wander off to do my own thing. But I'm not sure very many of us are like that. Silver Lake and Alanik, maybe. The rest? There are probably at least a few of them that would fight bitterly for a piece of their old life. Honestly, I don't think I could stay away, Zorian admitted. I'd try to reform my original into something better. Teach him a few things, nudge him into getting closer with Kirill, things like that. A bit manipulative, but it would come along with personal magic instruction and other help, so I think it could work. I wouldn't try to steal his life away, though. If there was no place for me in my old life, I would find something else to amuse myself with. As I said, I'm not sure everyone would be so serene about it, Kale pointed out. Yeah, I know, Zorian nodded. Zack and I purposely didn't raise the issue to the group, since we felt there was no way to reach any kind of official agreement on this. No matter the conclusion, someone would disagree. Possibly violently. The entire group might even fragment, if someone feels very strongly about the option that was chosen or not chosen. It's better to keep everyone focused on the immediate problem and worry about these things later. Despite such efforts, however, they already had a couple of casualties. 2 restarts ago, a pair of professors Xvim included into the group decided they couldn't handle the existential implications of the time loop and asked for their temporary markers to be removed so they could forget everything. Additionally, one of the Arania from the Luminous Advocates became so hysterical and violent that the other Arania asked for her to be stripped of her marker and ejected from the group. Zorian wasn't sure what had caused that, but since the other Luminous Advocates mysteriously acquired soul perception around that time, he suspected it was a product of some secret procedure they had collectively performed on themselves. In the interest of not starting a fight, though, he decided not to pursue the issue. With this being the last restart in which the temporary markers would remain effective, the pressure on people would only increase. Zorian really hoped nobody would crack too badly before the end. Break spells could only persist for so long. Even the most stable spell, supplied with an ample amount of mana, would fall apart in a couple of hours if not anchored to something. Thus, enhancement rituals had a problem. They aimed to place the user under a permanent magic effect or give them an innate magic ability, but that meant they had to anchor the spell to something to prevent it from decaying. This was a great problem. Anchoring the magic to one's flesh by inscribing sigils into the skin was ill-advised. Forcing large quantities of mana to flow through living flesh, even if it was one's personal mana, was usually unhealthy in the long term. Additionally, the resulting anchor was easy to break by physically harming the sigils, which was likely to result in dire consequences for the user. Abrupt, uncontrolled spell failures were dangerous enough in normal circumstances. When the spell was embedded into one's very flesh and bones, the grisly result could be easily imagined. Fortunately, there was a solution. Far in the distant past, some nameless mage had discovered how to repurpose a portion of their mana reserves into a spell anchor for the enhancement ritual. Since one's mana reserves were kept naturally stable by the soul, any magic fashioned from them would also be kept stable. The only problem was that since the anchor was literally made out of one's mana reserves, the caster would permanently have less mana at their disposal. The mana used in the construction of the anchor would never recover, since it was still there in the caster's reserves, being stabilized by their soul along with the rest of it. There was one additional issue, however. Even though an enhancement ritual could grant the user a magical ability, it was ultimately just fancy transformation magic. It never expired, it was almost impossible to dispel, and the user had very fine control over it, but they would not get the same instinctive affinity with it that the base creature had. This was where blood magic came into play. It allowed a mage to anchor the spell not only to their mana reserves, but to their life force as well. The resulting connection was deep and potent enough that the user's descendants had a chance to inherit the ability in question as a bloodline. The innate understanding of the base creature was also transferred over to the new user, allowing them to use it almost as well as someone who had been born with it right from the start. Enhancement rituals were dangerous. Poorly executed, they could kill the user or permanently ruin them as a mage. More than one mage had completely locked down their mana reserves or transformed them into something that ripped them to shreds from the inside. Blood magic rituals were dangerous. The user had to cut complicated patterns into their flesh and bleed themselves in order to stir up their vitality and coax their life force into appropriate structures. Unless one knew exactly what they were doing, it was very easy to die of blood loss, or worse. Zack and Zorian combined the two anyway. They started small, but moved on quickly to more ambitious projects due to time constraints. They made mistakes, but none of them too serious. And any lingering consequences were washed away at the end of every restart. With the help of Kale, they tracked down and talked with surviving Morlock blood mages scattered across the continent, seeking advice and tricks of the trade. They practiced with their new abilities and took note of which one worked best for them and why. Now, with time running out and this restart being so critical, they decided to immediately put those skills into practice. They performed the relevant rituals at the very beginning of the restart. A week and a half later, when their mana reserves and life force mostly stabilized, they gathered Xveem, Silver Lake and Dayman for a project that would test their dimensionalism skills to the limit. Something that would prove that they were capable of eventually creating the gateway out of the loop. They were going to create a miniature copy of the Palace Orb. Currently, Zack, Zorian, Silver Lake, Xveem and Dayman were all standing on the edge of a massive spell formula circle, equidistant from each other. They had spent the past several hours embedding the spell circle into the ground of this place, followed by setting up several complicated wards that had to be layered just right for the whole thing to work correctly. Now they were resting and adjusting their minds for the final task in front of them. There was a luxurious house sitting in the center of the circle, surrounded by a large garden and ornamental trees. It stood in a fairly isolated location, and Zack and Zorian actually bought the entire place, so they shouldn't be interrupted by anyone. Silver Lake complained about the amount of money that had been wasted on this, when they could have simply stolen a house from someone or picked a random patch of ground, but Zack didn't want to hear it. He wanted his own pocket mansion, and he wanted it to really be his. In any case, the idea behind their current project was a little different than that behind other pocket dimension creation projects. Previously, Zack and Zorian had focused on isolating a patch of space with a dimensional membrane and then inflating it to desired volume. Now they would be forcibly isolating a large patch of land from the rest of the world, compressing it and then attaching it to a prepared anchor object. In this case, that was a ball of magically reinforced glass, for maximum resemblance to the Palace Orb. This was similar to the method Silver Lake used to hide her home from outside scrutiny, but harder. Silver Lake simply compressed an area to make it seemingly disappear, but it remained connected to the rest of the world. That made her pocket dimension immovable, but easier to actually create. What they were doing now, however, would require them to effectively tear out a piece of reality and put it into a portable box for their own use. The house and its surrounding land were not nearly as big as the space inside the Palace Orb. Despite that, attempting this required all 5 of them to join hands and perform a group magic ritual, employing every trick and advantage they could think of. And they still weren't sure if they could pull it off. Zorian didn't even want to think what it took to create something like the actual Palace Orb. Looking around, Zorian saw that the others were well rested and ready to start. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. 5 simulacrums followed after him. Zorian had long since cracked the method that Princess used to coordinate her 8 heads as one entity, and was now capable of using it with his simulacrums. It was a fascinating thing, connecting multiple viewpoints and thought streams into one unified perspective, but it did have an important limitation: it could only be used when Zorian and his simulacrums were broadly doing the same thing, such as fighting the same enemy or cooperating on the same task. If he was reading books and Zioria and his simulacrums were scattered all over the world, each doing their own thing, there would be no connecting points to bind their consciousness together and the Hydra method couldn't be used. But for the task at hand, it was just perfect. He then activated the magic ability he had acquired through the enhancement ritual. He had acquired it from the humble tunneler Toad, whose ability to perceive and navigate warped space had seemed most useful for his purposes. It wasn't the best ability he could have gotten, but it was relatively cheap and worked well enough for Zorian's purposes. Anchoring it to his mana reserves robbed him of roughly 8% of his maximum mana, which pained him, but did not affect him too badly. Finally, he activated the mental enhancements he had crafted over the past year or so, helped by numerous Arania experts and even some human researchers. Many of his simulacrums paid with their short lives to test these enhancements, and the end result was appropriately impressive for something made after so much sacrifice. His thoughts immediately became clearer and more focused, his integration with his simulacrums deepened, and his ability to calculate and measure things at a glance became superhuman. Around him, he saw the others prepare themselves as well. Zack was leaning back and forth on his feet, humming some sort of tune to himself. He looked relaxed and careless, but there was a distant look in his eyes, as if he wasn't really all there. His choice for the creature to use an enhancement ritual on was the Void Soul Deer. Zack seemed to really like its ability to alter trajectories of things in the space around it, since that meant the ability was useful in combat, as well as for things like this. It was a fairly expensive ability in terms of mana reserves, but Zack was easily able to afford it. Zorian could feel the space around Zack ripple and warp as he flexed his new ability in preparation of the task at hand. Damon's presence was a bit of a surprise. Before the time loop, Damon hadn't even known how to cast the gate spell, never mind how to use pocket dimension magic. However, his reputation wasn't for nothing. With a year of time and access to all the restricted material and knowledgeable tutors he could wish for, Damon had experienced a meteoric rise in his dimensionalism skills. It reignited Zorian's jealousy a bit to see him blaze through things so easily, given that Zorian had to try so hard to get where Damon currently was, but objectively speaking, it was a good thing to have another capable dimensionalist on hand. It increased their chances of success immensely. Damon had also chosen to dabble in enhancement rituals along with Zack and Zorian, the only one of the temporary loopers that dared to do so. He picked a phase spider that Zack and Zorian were lucky to track down in one of the restarts. Their signature ability, which was literally a power to create small pocket dimensions, was bound to be very useful today. Silver Lake had stabbed 6 gold-plated stakes into the ground around her and was mumbling something to herself and making some sort of strange finger gestures. They didn't look like spellcasting gestures. It kind of reminded Zorian of Kirill trying to perform math with the help of her fingers, except that he knew damn well that Silver Lake was frighteningly good at performing calculations in her head. Her growth in skill over the past 5 restarts was difficult to judge, as she often did things on her own, and gave bullshit explanations when people tried to question her about it. Still, her skill at dimensionalism and soul magic made her one of the key people in the group, and little could be done about it. Xvim simply stood on the edge of the spell formula circle, staring forward with arms crossed behind his back. He gave off a silent and stoic air, as if the problem in front of them was no big deal at all. Zorian didn't think his magic had improved all that much in the past 5 restarts, but then again he had already been a highly capable archmage before the time loop had started. At his level, every improvement took a lot of time and effort as one started hitting their personal limits and their magic plateaued. With a silent signal, the five of them began casting. Glowing filaments of light sprang from Zorian's hands, and from the hands of his simulacrons, crisscrossing into a dome of light over the entire area, before seemingly sinking into thin air and disappearing. Silver Lake fired pitch-black beams from her fingers at seemingly random spots in the air, causing flashes of red light to burst out on the invisible boundary, while Zack and Xveen created pale white rings that spun lazily around the outer perimeter. Space warped and twisted, distorting the house and its surroundings like hot summer air and causing strange currents and whirlpools to be created in the sky. A spatial membrane eventually sprang up around the house, transparent and spherical. Its surface rippled and undulated like it was made from water. Strands of inky blackness occasionally radiated from points on its surface, as if reality itself was cracking apart and letting everyone see the terrible void that existed beneath everything. These were hurriedly sealed by the five participants, disappearing into flashes of rainbow light before springing back anew somewhere else. A miniature cyclone whipped about in the air, kicking up dust and pelting the participants with leaves and small stones. The process took hours and hours. 5 times they had to rest to recover their strength, but thankfully the ritual was designed specifically with that in mind. They knew they would not have enough mana to finish the project in one go, so small breathers were planned in advance. Eventually the process reached a critical point. The spatial membrane turned completely opaque and pitch black, its surface churning wildly like a pot of boiling water. Cracks spread out from the ground as the entire area was ripped out of the surrounding landscape, small tremors threatening to knock down the participants, something that would surely disrupt the casting at a critical moment and ruin everything. In the end everyone kept their balance, but the momentary distraction caused lances of spatial cracks to scythe through the area, reducing trees into chunks and utterly destroying one of Zorian's simulacrums. He managed to compensate for the loss, however, and the casting continued. The spherical black membrane started to repeatedly expand and then collapse inward, looking almost like a giant black heart. This process continued for several minutes, but if one observed the whole process carefully they would notice that the sphere was gradually getting smaller and smaller. It was being repeatedly compressed into an ever-decreasing volume. When the sphere had reached half of its original size, a fundamental change occurred and the whole area of space seemed to collapse inward, as if it was about to be sucked into a tiny point in the center. Zack reacted immediately, throwing a large glass ball into the center of the collapsing mass while the rest scattered 16 stone stabilizers into the surrounding space. Each of the stones was a cube densely covered in spell formula, and they immediately floated into a dense spherical formation around the black mass in only a few seconds. The black mass was completely sucked into the glass ball and everything was silent and still. The strange lights and spatial distortions disappeared. The area inside the spell formula circle had completely disappeared, leaving behind a circular crater where the house and garden once stood. In the center of that crater floated an innocuous-looking glass globe, with 16 stone cubes lazily orbiting around it. Then, with a deafening boom, all of the stone cubes shattered and fell to the ground. The glass globe was still fine, however, the stabilizers had sacrificed themselves to give that final push for the whole process and firmly attach the newly made pocket mansion to its portable anchor. If one looked closely, they would be able to see a miniature, lifelike house suspended in the center of the globe. It even appeared intact, which was great. There was a non-trivial chance for everything inside the globe to end up getting wrecked by the stresses of the creation process, if it was not channeled properly. Complete success. Everyone gathered around the globe to gawk at it and admire their handiwork. Zack, Zorian, Silver Lake and Dayman were in visibly high spirits following the success of such a difficult project. Only Xveen managed to retain his reserved attitude, though Zorian felt he still looked faintly pleased with himself. "You know, I just realized I have no idea how you intend to power this thing," Damon said. "Surely this thing requires a great deal of mana to keep stable." "We placed a permanent miniature gate inside the house," Zack said. "It connects to a cavern deep in the dungeon, sucking up mana to keep both the gate and the pocket dimension operating. It's too tiny for the dungeon denizens to pass through, but mana can be collected just fine." "Oh, you cracked Quatachichel's permanent gates?" Damon asked, surprised. Silver Lake puffed herself up, looking pretty smug. Her contributions were pretty crucial in cracking the method Quatachichel used to make his gate stabilization frame. Hers and, oddly enough, that of the filigree sages. Their method of creating spell formula anchors had some surprising similarities to the methods Quatachichel used in his construction of the stabilization frames. "Yes, we finally managed to replicate the Lich's methods," confirmed Zorian. "It has limited usefulness to us as a method of transport, though, since it takes a while to make those. It's more convenient to just use my simulacrums as mobile gate creators." "We have made a great deal of progress," Xvim spoke up. "This globe is a perfect representation of that. However, I wonder if that is really enough to let us make a gateway leading out of the time loop." Everyone shared a look for a moment as they considered the issue. "We have a chance," Zorian said. "The chance is too low for my liking," Silver Lake grumbled, before Zorian could say anything else. Her good mood seemed to deflate a little. "If we had another 6 months." "But we don't. We won't be able to crack the temporary markers in less than a month," Zack told her. "Why even waste time thinking about that?" "Well, it's easy for you and Zorian to be so relaxed about that," Silver Lake sneered at him. "You'll still be there, even if this all fails, won't you?" "You are oversimplifying things and you know it," Zorian said, frowning. "The protections on the temporary markers are such that we won't be able to place temporary markers on you for the next 6 restarts. We have no hope at all of pulling this off without you. Thus, we would be forced to wait until the very last moment to make our next attempt. And if that fails, we are lost. Do you honestly think Zack and I are comfortable with that? We are just as invested in the success of this project as you are." "HMPH, Silver Lake scoffed. "Almost as invested, I suppose. But not quite as much." "What do you think they should have done, then?" Xvim asked, giving her a knowing look. "They should have experimented more freely with temporary markers in people's souls. There are plenty of people in the world that nobody cares about, and it's not like the damage would have been permanent," Silver Lake said, looking Xvim straight in the eye. Her voice was loud and clear, but perfectly calm. "They should have given Quatachichel a temporary marker and recruited him into the group." Ugh. Both ideas were already discussed and soundly rejected, and not just by Zack and Zorian, Xvim pointed out. "We were already taking a huge risk by dealing with the Lich as much as we did," Zorian said. "Even a minor mistake could easily burn all of our remaining restarts away. The old bag of bones would be more likely to ruin us than help us," Zack added. "Without us, his plan probably succeeds and Cioria is leveled to the ground. Why would he want to risk that by helping us escape?" "Bah!" Silver Lake spat. As in, she literally spat on the ground to express her frustration. "I can see when I'm outvoted. Besides, it's too late to change things now. Though I still say our chances are too low. Surely there is something more that could be done?" "Well, you did say we just need more time," Damon pointed out. "If the project to turn the palace orb into a black room succeeds as well as expected, we should get another couple of months in a time dilation room. We already turned the palace room into a time dilation chamber 2 times by now," Silver Lake pointed out. "It was impressive, but the effectiveness was little better than that of a regular black room. It just had larger volume. Why expect this attempt to be any different? Well, if Cranton and his staff are to be believed, began Damon. I'll believe it when I see it, Silver Lake cut him off. In the meantime, I have another idea. Although Silver Lake could be very abrasive and unpleasant, her skill at dimensionalism was undeniable and many of her ideas were quite insightful. Some of them were even perfectly ethical and legal, shockingly enough. Thus, the group eventually returned to Ceoria, peacefully discussing various plans along the way. Break. The search for the Imperial staff was long and frustrating. For a long time, they didn't have even the slightest clue how to narrow down their search. Zorian was almost willing to write off the entire endeavor as a lost cause and focus entirely on the exit portal project. However, Damon felt it was beneath his pride to let the expedition end in failure, and eventually found a clue. One of their earliest leads for the staff was a dragon mage called Violet-Eyed Disaster, or just Violet-Eye for short. However, she was almost as hard to track down as the staff itself, and there were plenty of other candidates around, so they didn't focus on her in particular. In time, however, a curious fact became obvious. Violet-Eye seemed capable of instantaneously teleporting herself across vast distances. There was simply no other way to explain how she could get around so quickly and evade pursuers. Dragons were fast flyers, but her speed was unearthly. This idea was reinforced when Damon and his group caught sight of her and pursued, only for her to disappear when they briefly lost sight of her. This was significant, since dragon mages had huge issues trying to use teleportation. Dimensional magic was nearly unknown among dragons, and the sort of teleportation Violet-Eye was performing would be shocking even in a human mage. She was most likely using some kind of divine artifact to pull it off. And by following after her and repeatedly provoking her, Zack and Zorian eventually confirmed it was a simple, unadorned staff. Deep in the jungles of Blantyre, atop a small mountain, a fierce battle was raging between Zack and Zorian on one side and Violet-Eye the dragon mage on the other. Shattered remains of Zorian's combat golems littered the mountainside, and several large craters lay scattered around the place. Smoke and dust covered the skies. Roaring in outrage, Violet-Eye swooped down on Zack's position, opening her jaws and breathing fire at him. The jet of flame was unnaturally hot and concentrated, even for dragon breath, a white-hot incineration beam that set nearby bushes on fire just by passing near them. Without flinching, Zack placed an opaque black shield made out of spatial forces in front of him. The incineration breath sank into the shield and harmlessly disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. Moments later, he was hit by a gust of magically enhanced wind. It looked rather ethereal, a gentle rainbow glow suffusing it, but the moment it reached Zack it caused the black shield to collapse into nothingness and almost sent him tumbling down the mountainside. A trio of stone cylinders flew in the air towards the dragon, shining with dangerous blue light. She managed to knock them away from her before they exploded, but it disrupted her charge and allowed Zack to regain his balance. She sent a quick glare at Zorian, who was standing in the distance with a gun-like cylinder launcher in his hands, before judging Zack a greater threat and smashing her tail towards him like a flail. Zack didn't try to dodge or put some distance between them. He merely cast another spell, causing huge hands of stone to erupt from the ground beneath her, reaching towards her. Her eyes narrowed imperceptibly, but she continued her attack, trusting her strength and vast reserves of magic. She was justified in her confidence when trading blow for blow with a human, since they could never match a dragon in terms of toughness. However, her attack missed. Her eyes widened in surprise, not understanding what had happened. This wasn't the sort of rookie mistake she could ever make. If one had looked really closely, though, One could have seen space itself subtly shift around Zack just before the tail slap had descended upon him. The stone hands closed around the dragon, pulling her downward. She manifested huge ectoplasmic claws to crush them into powder, but the moment of weakness was enough for Zorian's simulacrums, who immediately teleported into the vicinity. Just as she was about to turn her ectoplasmic claws towards the simulacrums, her mind swam in sudden vertigo and her vision grew blurry. When she finally regained her clarity of mind, she found a glittering crystalline spear flying at her, courtesy of Zack. Arcs of red light sparked dangerously on its surface, promising pain and disintegration to anything hit by the spear. Invading the mind of a dragon was not an easy thing to do. But it was within Zorian's capabilities, if only for a moment. Roaring, Violeta conjured an omnidirectional sound wave that hurled all of the simulacrums away from her like a bunch of rag dolls and destroyed all nearby obstacles. The spear continued to fly, but it was knocked off course and only glanced off her flank, tearing out a chunk of her flesh but largely leaving her intact. She launched herself in the air and tried to flee. She didn't teleport away like she had the first few times Zack and Zorian had tried to corner her, presumably because the staff she was using had run out of charges by now. However, she was still a dragon, and few things could catch her in flight if she fled at maximum speed. Zack and Zorian were nearly out of mana by this point, and Zorian was starting to run out of bombs and other items, too. Even Zack, with his immense mana reserves, could not compare to the stamina of the dragon. They could chase her down, but if she kept stalling and disengaging, she would eventually wear them down and maybe even turn the tables on them. She probably knew that and was deliberately using that as a tactic. Considering that she was armed with a convenient retreat in the form of the teleportation staff, this was probably how she usually fought. Wearing down the enemy by repeatedly retreating and coming back was likely second nature to her by now. Unfortunately for her, Zack and Zorian weren't alone. Before she could get very far, she found Alanik, Xvim and Damon waiting for her in the distance. A roar of frustration echoed across the entire mountain while Zack and Zorian sat down to recover their mana reserves and catch their breath. "Ha ha, I bet she didn't expect that," Zack said, grinning. His face was smeared with dust and there was a thin line of blood running down his left arm where a piece of shrapnel managed to get through his defenses, but he appeared to not notice it. Now she, too, can experience what it's like to be worn down by repeated attacks while her opponents take a rest every once in a while. "Didn't you kill Ogange, who is a famous dragon mage, all by yourself in one of the early restarts?" Zorian asked curiously. "I know he couldn't teleport around and was less annoying to fight, but he shouldn't be any weaker. How on earth did you manage to tackle him on your own?" "Trial and error," Zack chuckled awkwardly. "Lots of trial and error. I honestly do not recommend it." They fell silent after that, simply watching the battle unfold in front of them. "Break, we've done it," Zack breathed. Laid on the ground in front of him were 5 objects, a glass orb, a plain metal ring, a gleaming dagger, an ornate crown and a simple staff. All 5 pieces of the key, gathered in one place. The staff Violeta had been using was indeed the Imperial staff they were looking for. They had already brought it to the Guardian of the Threshold for inspection and found out about its powers. It had the ability to place up to 6 undetectable recall points and allowed the user to teleport back to their recall points, regardless of the distances involved. Each recall point could only be used once every 24 hours, but this was still a very potent ability. That was for normal users. For the TimeLoop controller, the staff was even more useful, since the recall points remained in place across restarts. That meant that if one began a restart with the staff in their hands, they could potentially travel anywhere on the planet in the blink of an eye. Zack and Zorian didn't begin their restarts with the staff in their hands, though, so the item's usefulness was nearly non-existent. They had to travel so long and search so far for an item that gave godlike movement capabilities to people. There was some dark humor in the situation, but Zorian didn't feel like he could appreciate it at the moment. In any case, at this point the whole thing didn't matter. The staff was important because it was part of the key needed to unbar the exit of the time loop, not because of its innate properties. Of course, by the time they acquired it, they already had the orb and the ring, so they were only missing 2 more items to complete the set. The dagger and the crown. The dagger was, well, not exactly easy to acquire, but it was entirely doable at this point. They had familiarized themselves enough with the wards and the royal treasury that they could break into it and steal the dagger on their own, without any help from Kutachichil. So they did just that. It caused a terrible uproar, and everyone was still searching for the thieves, but Zack and Zorian were fairly sure they had covered their tracks well enough. Getting the crown, on the other hand, had been something they had agonized quite a bit over. They succeeded in the end, but now they had Kutachichil after their heads and the restart was not even halfway over. The ancient lich had plenty of time to track them down and make them pay for what they did, which is something they never let him have in the previous restarts. Still, with only one piece of the key missing, how could they possibly resist the temptation to complete it? There was no way they could have waited until the end of the restart to do this. For all they knew, using the key may give them options that hadn't existed until now. Numerous people crowded the space around Zack and Zorian, peering at the items on the ground. Pretty much everyone had arrived to take a look at them, even though they were nothing special in terms of appearance. Scattered whispering and quiet speculation filled the air and people speculated what would happen when they were brought before the Guardian of the Threshold. After some quick discussion, Zack and Zorian decided to bring the key to the Guardian of the Threshold right away to see what would happen. And they would be taking everyone with them to witness it as well. Previously, they had already tried to bring a temporary looper into the space of the Sovereign Gate and failed. The Guardian of the Threshold later confirmed the temporary loopers are unable to access this space. However, this security measure was childishly easy to bypass through a short-duration soul bond that allowed the controller to simply pull outsiders with them as they entered the Sovereign Gate. Once inside, the Guardian of the Threshold largely ignored their presence, recognizing them as temporary loopers, but completely unconcerned about the fact that Zack and Zorian were breaking the rules. Zack and Zorian had used this method to bring various people into the Sovereign Gate at multiple occasions, so they did not foresee any problems. Thus, the whole group made way into the secret time magic research facility beneath Seoria and, after some small preparations, entered the Sovereign Gate. The Guardian of the Threshold soon popped into existence in front of them, just like he always did. He was still the same human-like glowing entity, his face emotionless like a sculpted statue. "Welcome, Controller," the Guardian greeted. Yeah, said Zack. "I'm glad to see you too, you lovable idiot. Did you notice we've brought the key to you?" The Guardian was silent for a moment. "One moment, please," it eventually said, before becoming silent again. In the dark void of the Sovereign Gate space, there was only a silent glowing humanoid and a small throng of people anxiously waiting for his reaction. The Guardian of the Threshold did not appear to mind the large number of visitors, continuing his mysterious pondering with not a care in the world. The temporary loopers around Zack and Zorian simply squirmed nervously, not saying much. They had learned by now that the Guardian of the Threshold utterly ignored temporary loopers, refusing to answer their questions or even acknowledge their existence. Watching Damon and Silverlake getting progressively more angry as the entity ignored their comments had been rather amusing for Zorian the first time he witnessed it. But thankfully this time nobody lost their temper. In any case, the Guardian eventually finished whatever it was doing and started speaking again. "Everything is as it should be," it said. "The key is valid. Do you want to claim your privileges now?" "Privileges? Why, I love privileges," Zack said, grinning. "Yes. Give me all of those." "Done," the entity immediately said. "Can't I unbar the gate now?" Zack asked. "Yes," the Guardian of the Threshold confirmed. "Do you want?" "Yes, damn it, yes," Zack said, voice full of exasperation. "Do it now." "As you wish," it said. It paused for a few moments, silently performing some kind of task again. "It is done. The gate is now unbarred. Zorian watched in growing horror as the Guardian of the Threshold suddenly started twitching and stuttering as if it was having some kind of seizure. His head rolled around at impossible angles, rotating a full 360 degrees, his entire torso squirming and bulging as if something was trying to burst out of it. He had a very bad feeling about this. "What the hell is happening?" someone asked behind him. "I don't know," Zack said, frowning. "This has never happened before." Everything suddenly became quiet. At first Zorian thought Zack had just stopped speaking because he noticed or realized something important, but when he glanced towards him he found Zack gone. Everyone but Zorian was gone. It was just him, a madly twitching Guardian of the Threshold, and a quiet, featureless black void all around them. He immediately tried to return to his body, but failed. Shit. Well, at least the Guardian of the Threshold was starting to calm down. He was twitching less, and no longer twisted his head and limbs at impossible angles. Maybe. A multitude of eyes suddenly snapped open all over Guardian of the Threshold's body, blinking rapidly for a few moments before focusing straight at Zorian. Each one was different. Different sizes, different color, different internal structure. Some of them had multiple irises. Some of them glowed. Some of them were multifaceted, like those of an insect. Some of them made his mind feel numb just looking at them. "Zorian Kaczynski," the Guardian of the Threshold said. Was it still the Guardian of the Threshold? Freaky eyes aside, even his voice was different. It was booming and resonant, with not a trace of humanity in it. "I have a proposition for you." "Who are you?" Zorian immediately challenged. "You call me Panaxith," it immediately answered. Zorian's mind froze for a moment. "What? How? The Primordial?" he asked numbly, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," it answered. Suddenly, some of its eyes closed and disappeared. The ones that made Zorian hurt to look at, as well as some of the freakier normal ones. "You can talk?" Zorian asked. It was a dumb question, but he was still in shock and couldn't help himself. Panaxith seemed to think so too, because he ignored the question. "I can get you out of here," Panaxith said. Its form changed again, additional eyes closing and his form becoming more human-like in both color and texture. "All you have to do is make a contract with me." "A contract?" "No thanks," he said immediately, shaking his head in denial. "You will never get out of here alive without me," it told him. Its voice acquired a human-like quality by this point, and most of the eyes were gone. The other person didn't either. "Red Robe?" Zorian asked. "I never asked his name," Panaxith said. He looked entirely like a man by now, though his features seemed to shift all the time, male and female, old and young, all kinds of skin tones and facial features. "Does it matter? We're talking about you, now. Swear on your life you will help free me and I will incarnate you outside of this crumbling world." "Why would I do that, though?" Zorian asked. "You get to live," Panaxith asked, sounding a little mystified by his response. His constant shifting of his appearance slowed down greatly at this point. He seemed to have settled on a female form now, tall and good-looking, with long black hair and a body to die f. Zorian scowled. The damn thing was slowly changing its appearance to appeal to him as much as possible, wasn't it? It constantly cycled through different appearances, all the while paying attention to his body movements and facial expressions to see what evoked a good response in him. It was showing him what it thought he wanted to see. Suddenly, the entity shifted into a perfect copy of Kirill. "I just want to live and be free," she said, her lip quivering and her voice on the verge of tears. "You are not Kirill." Zorian shouted at it, his temper rising. Pernaxeth immediately changed forms again, copying Taven. Then Zach. Then Xvim, Damon, Ilsa, Amaya. Some of these people. How did it even know how they looked and sounded? Was it reading his mind? He immediately strengthened his mental defenses, even though he could detect no intrusion. "Why are you talking to me now?" Zorian asked. "I was here plenty of times before. The gate was barred until now, so there was no point in speaking to you," Pernaxeth answered. "I can only get people out when the way is open." "But you could have contacted me like this all this time?" Zorian asked. "Yes," Pernaxeth confirmed. "The Sovereign Gate has been damaged over the years, some of the safeguards failing. That is why they stopped using it for a long time. However, there is no point in speaking to most people unless they are strong enough to help me and unless the way is open. I did not think you could gather the entire key before the world crumbled, but I'm glad to be proved wrong. We can help each other, Zorian. We can even discuss additional rewards once I am out of my cage." "But what if I fail?" Zorian asked. "You die, of course," Pernaxeth said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "That's what the contract is for. So you get me out of here and in return I must help free you or die?" Zorian asked. "Exactly," Pernaxeth confirmed. "I'm going to have to say no," Zorian sighed. Pernaxeth stared at him for a second. It seemed to realize it would never be able to convince Zorian to take this sort of deal, no matter what it used to entice him. "You will regret that," it said. "This was a one-time offer. I will not bother contacting you again." Zorian was of two minds about this. On one hand it was a bit disappointing, since he would like to have more talks with the Primordial to see if he could get something substantial out of it. On the other hand, it was a freaking Primordial and it seemed to be reading his mind in some way he couldn't detect. It was probably for the best that it never wanted to see him again. "You gave up pretty quickly," Zorian commented. "How are you so sure there is no chance to convince me in the future?" "It doesn't matter anymore," Pernaxeth said. "Someone else has already taken my offer." Zorian's eyes widened at the comment. Before he could ask Pernaxeth what it meant by that, the generic female form in front of him disappeared and he was surrounded by noise again. He was once again standing next to Zack, with temporary loopers standing around him. All of them were screaming, shouting and talking at once. It was abundantly obvious that Zorian wasn't the only one who had found himself alone, facing a terrifying primordial entity. And after the situation had calmed down somewhat and he had done a quick head count, a terrifying realization suddenly dawned to Zorian. Silver Lake was gone. Chapter 090 Change of Plans. It wasn't long before the group decided to leave the Sovereign Gate space and return to their bodies outside. Partially this was because the Guardian of the Threshold was gone, leaving them on their own in the silent void. When Pernaxeth ended his interaction with Zorian and others, he took the Guardian he had been possessing along with him. Or maybe he was the Guardian in the end, who could know? Regardless, with the Guardian no longer present, there was little point in them staying there either. The second, more important reason, was that Silver Lake was gone and they desperately wanted to check if she was outside, waiting for them. although Panaxith's statement that someone had already taken his offer and her subsequent disappearance strongly suggested she had betrayed them, Zorian held on to the hope that she had merely left the Sovereign Gate on her own. Somehow. It was a hope that would not last long. Whatever force Panaxith had used to stop Zack and Zorian from returning to their body had dissipated with his disappearance, so getting out of the Sovereign Gate was done without incident. Once outside, they found Silver Lake's lifeless body lying on the floor. She was dead. There was no evidence of struggle. No wounds, obvious or subtle. No indication of any sort of foul play from the facility staff or hidden enemies. It was as if her soul simply disappeared from her body all of a sudden, painlessly killing her. It was the same kind of dead that they had already seen in the area beneath Sioria and the other Salkeld individuals they'd come across over the restarts. A grim atmosphere descended upon the group. Zack was so enraged he incinerated Silver Lake's body into ashes before anyone could stop him. Zorian wanted to scold him for destroying critical clues as to what happened, but Ilanik placed his hand on his shoulder and shook his head, silently telling him to let it go. Maybe it was better that way. This wasn't the time for starting arguments, and they probably got all they would have gotten out of her corpse anyway. They didn't stay in the time magic research facility for long. They needed to talk to everyone about what they had seen and heard, about what Panaxith had told them in private, but that was best done in the privacy of their base at the Nevada estate. However, an issue suddenly rose up when they tried to leave the facility. Apparently, while the facility staff accepted their mysterious orders without complaint, they still paid close attention to everyone coming and leaving from the facility. They knew exactly how many people their group had, and they knew that Silver Lake had suddenly gone missing. That was a surprisingly thorny situation to get out of. Zack was still visibly fuming and looked like he was going to start throwing around fireballs at all these people questioning him where their companion had suddenly disappeared to, but Grantan refused to let the matter drop. Unfortunately, explaining that Silver Lake was dead and that Zack had already incinerated her soulless body was not an option. In the end, Zorian had to memory edit roughly half of the facility personnel to make them forget Silver Lake had ever entered the place that day and then make alterations to the physical records which also kept track of that kind of thing. Strange as that sounded, altering physical records turned out to be a lot harder than editing memories. Those records had some very inventive protections against such tampering, whereas the minds of facility staff were largely unprotected against mental tampering. Still, although the immediate issue was dealt with, Zorian could already see that their headaches in regards to the facility and Silver Lake's presence there were only starting. Silver Lake had been one of the crucial people in regards to their project of turning the Imperial Orb into a better Black Room. The void left by her disappearance was going to be keenly felt in the near future. He still had trouble believing this was actually happening, to be honest. He had fully expected their circumstances to change once they brought the key to the Guardian of the Threshold, but not like this. How could Panaxith even contact them through the Guardian? Even if the Sovereign Gate was made from a primordial, that primordial was clearly not Panaxith. He of the flowing flesh was imprisoned inside the hole, the massive circular abyss around which Sioria was built. He had been stuck there since the time the primordials had been sealed away, presumably. The Sovereign Gate, on the other hand, had been primarily used in northern Myocena before its current use. It didn't make sense. How could Panaxith infiltrate the time loop mechanism to appear before them? How could he take people out of the time loop? And what had he offered Silver Lake to make her swear some kind of death pact with a godlike primordial entity that considered them useful tools at best? He didn't know. He hoped other people had managed to get something useful out of the primordial, unlike him. Having finally left the facility, the group gathered in the Nevada estate. They left people some free time to collect their thoughts and calm down, and then started discussing what happened. The first issue, of course, was Panaxith. Or something that claimed to be Panaxith, anyway. They had no proof that the unknown entity was telling the truth, but then again it had no reason to lie about that either. Identifying as Panaxith would not set anyone at ease. In any case, talking to the rest of the group confirmed what everyone had suspected by now. Panaxith had somehow dragged each of them into their own individual space for a private conversation. Everyone except Zack, that is. Zack alone did not merit a meeting with the Primordial, it seemed. While everyone else disappeared into their own private space, Zack was simply left alone in the darkness of the Sovereign Gates area. Even the Guardian of the Threshold was gone, leaving him simply floating in the silent void with no way out until Panaxith was done with the others. As for the others, they'd all found themselves in front of the warped, twisted Guardian of Threshold, though most did not see the same eye-covered humanoid that Zorian had. In Chiron's case, for instance, the Guardian grew another 2 pairs of arms while his torso split open into a giant vertical mouth lined with predatory teeth. Nora saw the Guardian's limbs lengthen while bone spikes erupted from its head, causing it to look like it had a bony sea urchin growing out of its neck. This initial monstrous form was then gradually changed into a more inoffensive, human form through a process of constant shape-shifting reminiscent of the one Zorian experienced. After that, though, the experiences of different people wildly diverged. Not all received the offer of making a contract with the Primordial. Tivan and Nora were almost completely toyed with, for instance. Panaxith simply shifted between different forms while occasionally spouting total non-sequiturs like "I like dogs" or "Your mother would be ashamed of you," seemingly studying the reactions. Damon claimed that Panaxith had never offered him anything, instead simply trying to question him about what he knew about Zorian, his likes, motives and preferences. Something that visibly infuriated his older brother, though Zorian was unsure how much of that was because Panaxith was basically trying to get him to betray his family and how much it was the fact that Panaxith clearly didn't see him as important outside of being Zorian's brother. If the situation weren't so dire, Zorian might have been amused about that. It also quickly became clear that, even though everyone was reunited at roughly the same time, they did not spend the same amount of time talking to Panaxith. Some, like Zorian, only interacted with the Primordial for a short while before being dismissed. Others, especially ones that pretended to actually consider its offer, spoke with the entity for quite a while before Panaxith tired of them. The Primordial employed some kind of time dilation during its interaction with people, lengthening the meeting with ones that seemed like they could be convinced, while spending only a token effort on others. This probably explained how it managed to convince Silver Lake so relatively quickly. If she showed the greatest amount of interest in its offer out of them all, the Primordial would have likely extended her meeting as much as it could. Plus, considering how powerful and experienced Silver Lake was, she was probably considered one of the most prioritized targets to begin with. Were you not worried that the Primordial was reading your mind? Zorian asked them, frowning. I mean, it seemed capable of lifting people's appearances straight out of my head when I talked to it. It was one of the big reasons I was so eager to get out of the meeting as much as possible. He did no such thing while talking to me, Xvim said, shaking his head. Then again, Panaxith did not try to copy any people while talking to me. He just shifted from one generic form to another throughout the entire talk. Zorian found it a little interesting how some people, like him, referred to Panaxith as it, while Xvim and others referred to the Primordial as he. The cultists did call Panaxith he of the flowing flesh, so one could indeed argue that the entity was male in some sense, but it was debatable how much normal gender applied to a monstrous Shepech angel like that. The entity assumed a female form when speaking to him, male form in front of others, and an Arania form when speaking to the Arania. It clearly thought little of such things. I actually did ask the thing about that when it tried to shapeshift into Kana, Kale said, pausing slightly. Well, more like I blew up at it and demanded an explanation. Sparingly, it actually gave me one. It said no mind reading was taking place. It was just watching everything we did inside the time loop and taking note of people close to us. That's probably why it tried to convince me while looking like Kana instead of Namura, even though the latter would probably be more effective. Since my wife had died long before the start of the time loop, Panaxith had no idea what she looked like, and thus couldn't copy her appearance. Yes, that is what he said to me as well, Ilsa said. He tried to tempt me with the secrets of true creation, and I asked how he knew about that. He said the same thing he had to kill, but he also expanded on it a little bit. Panaxith claims the Sovereign Gate is not made from a primordial like we thought, it is more like an attachment, or maybe a shell, which must be bonded to a specific primordial in order to work. This can potentially be any primordial, but currently it's Panaxith. That's why he could appear in front of us like that, Zack said gloomily. Yes, Ilsa said, nodding. The Sovereign Gate somehow twists the primordial in question into the time loop as we know it. In a very real sense, Panaxith is the time loop. Which means he's aware of everything that occurs inside of him. So Panaxith is watching us even now? Taven said, sounding disturbed. Probably, Ilsa shrugged. She seemed to take the idea in stride. Or maybe she'd just had more time than the rest of them to come to terms with it. Zorian was personally very disturbed by this discovery. How were they supposed to subvert the time loop mechanism in order to leave this place, if the time loop was basically a sapient being that was always watching them? It was quite likely that Panaxith could actively sabotage any escape attempt it did not like. Perhaps it was limited by the safeguards built into the Sovereign Gate, but those safeguards probably wouldn't protect people like him, who were trying to break the system. No wonder Panaxith claimed he was never leaving this place without its help. Back then, Zorian thought that meant without its help, but perhaps what Panaxith really meant was without its approval. If he is that all-knowing, I wonder why he had not been more effective at tempting us, Xvi mused. One would think he would have a far better grasp on our character if it could perceive everything we did so far. Awareness is not necessarily total awareness, Arissa offered. I am technically aware of everything my bees do, but if you were to ask me about one particular bee, there is only so much I could tell you. The various elementals we consulted did say that primordials view us all like animals, maybe even mere bugs, Zack said. How much do you really understand the sparrows living in the city or ants digging up your garden? We may be greater than them, but they are still alien to us. Hell, Zorian can read their minds and memories, and he still has trouble leading them from place to place without using any magical coercion. You're talking about that one time he tried to literally hurt cats, right? Kale said, smiling slightly. I remember that one. It wasn't a serious attempt, Zorian complained. It was just an amusing idea I had when I was bored. This isn't the time for this, Alanik said, a little annoyed. Zack brings up a good point with primordials seeing us all as animals. You don't discuss things with animals, you manipulate them into doing what you want. We should be wary of trusting that creature too much. Although there is probably some glimmer of truth in what it's saying, I suspect it is willing to say anything, true or false, if it thinks doing so will increase its chances of escaping its prison. I don't know. He seemed pretty honest and forthright to me, Ilsa said, looking at Alanik. Clearly you also thought there was some value in listening to it, since you were one of the people that managed to engage it in a lengthy conversation. What did you speak about, then? Ultimately, Only a few people managed to keep their cool and get something substantial out of Panaxith. Alanik, Xvim, Arissa, Ilsa, Chiron and an Arania named Night Dream were the only ones that managed to interest Panaxith enough for him to engage them in a lengthy back and forth. It made Zorian a little self-conscious to realize he had essentially bungled that meeting. He might have gotten some important answers out of the primordial if he had been a little better at acting. Then again, were these people really so good at acting, or were they actually somewhat tempted by Panaxith's offer, and the primordial could sense that in their exchange? He could tell that Ilsa, at the very least, was lying when she claimed she had only been pretending to be interested in the primordial's offer. The others were harder to read. In any case, Alanik did not appear in the slightest bit uncomfortable about being put on the spot like that. We had a big talk about faith, risk-taking and the duty of the individual towards their community, Alanik said. Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. So did a lot of other people, from what he could see. And you were scolding me and Zorian for not taking things seriously just a little while ago, Kale scoffed. It's the truth, Alanik said. Rather than just refuse the creature, I asked it why I would ever agree to such a deal. The consequences would be so apocalyptic, especially for Seoria, that I couldn't imagine how this would be a good idea. Even if I was selfish to the extreme and only cared about myself, the primordial was a threat to all of humanity. Oh, I asked him the same thing, Arissa interjected. He said he had no intention of destroying the world or menacing humanity. All he wanted, he said, was to be free and to free the rest of the imprisoned primordials as well. He would only destroy those who tried to prevent him from achieving those two goals. Ha! Well, it said no such thing to me, Alanik said. Probably because it knew I would not believe that. Instead, the primordial countered my concerns by telling me that the gods had left numerous contingencies in regards to primordials, should they ever successfully escape. If I truly had faith in the gods, it said, what was the harm in setting it free? The contract would be fulfilled the moment it was out of prison, even if it died immediately afterwards. I should have faith in the divine and their works, in which case there was nothing wrong with taking the deal, releasing it out of its prison and then watching it die immediately afterwards. Do these contingencies of the gods truly exist? Zorian asked. He heard nothing about that, but Alanik was a priest, so. I don't know, Alanik admitted. Even if they did, it is said the gods imprisoned primordials because they had trouble truly killing them. If the gods were incapable of dealing with them in person, I rather doubt a mere contingency could do it. Clearly this Panaxith did not believe this either, otherwise why would it even make the offer? We then got into a lengthy philosophical discussion about what constitutes true faith and various other things. I doubt you really want to hear about that. Maybe later, Zack said. Arissa, you said you also talked to Panaxith about what he'd do once free. Yes. Aside from what I already said, I think he alluded to these divine contingencies Alanik spoke about at one point, she said. He mentioned that, in the process of tearing himself free from his cage, he would likely end up weakened and grievously wounded, and that it would take him centuries to fully recover. During that time, he would just hide somewhere and wait until he was fully healed. He was suggesting that I had no reason to care about his goals, because by the time he was ready to make his move, I would have died a long time ago. After some more back and forth, they confirmed some details with the other members of the group. For instance, it seemed that nobody had been presented with an image of a person that had died before the time loop had begun. In fact, the primordial didn't even bother copying living relatives, if the temporary looper hadn't interacted with them within the bounds of the time loop. This led some credence to his claim that he couldn't read minds and just relied on seeing everything that ever happened in the time loop. This done, They turned to the last three people who had spoken to Pranaxith at any real length. Xvim, Chiron and Night Dream had all asked similar questions. However, they wanted to know the details of what the contract with Pranaxith actually entailed. Thankfully, this appeared to be a topic that Pranaxith was really eager to talk about. So if I understood you three correctly, the contract is as follows. Zorian said. You make a death pact with Pranaxith, swearing that you would either free him within a month or die trying. He then takes your soul and incarnates it in the outside world. That is to say, he creates a brand new copy of your body in the real world, at the start of the month, in effect physically ejecting you out of the time loop. Included in the created body is some kind of kill switch that will kill you if Pranaxith is still imprisoned at the end of the summer festival. Yes, Night Dream said, her magically produced voice clear and smooth. It doesn't matter whether you tried your best or why you failed. If Pranaxith isn't free by the end of the deadline, the death seal activates and kills you. No excuses. And if Pranaxith is freed at any point before the deadline, this kill switch dissolves into nothingness and you are free to do whatever you want? Zorian asked. Yes, even if Pranaxith dies, our part of the agreement is done, Xvim confirmed. I asked several variations of that question just to be sure, and he always answered the same. We only needed to get him out, nothing more. Our original selves were not part of the agreement, either, and would not suffer if we failed in our task. Probably because their bodies hadn't been created by Pranaxith, so he cannot place his death seal thingy on them, Chiron remarked. Even if he wanted to make them die with us, he cannot. What stops you from taking the deal and then working against Pranaxith? Assuming you don't mind dying in a month, of course, Alanik asked. When I asked a question along those lines, the shape-shifting asshole immediately ended our conversation and sent me back to the group, Chiron said. I guess he really didn't like that question. From what I can tell, though, the answer is nothing. Nothing stops you from doing just that. Then, Kale said hesitantly, do you think that Silver Lake? Chiron let loose a short, loud laugh. Boy, get real. He told Kale. Do you think a selfish, self-centered bitch like that would agree to sacrifice herself for our sake? For anyone's sake? Kale sighed, saying nothing. A quiet murmur rippled throughout the entire group as they discussed the topic among themselves. Zorian listened to it with half an ear while lost in his own thoughts. Truthfully, now that he had heard about other people's experiences with Pranaxith, her choice was predictable. It wasn't that they had trusted her because they had thought that she was better than this, they had just never realized making a deal like this was even an option. If Zorian had known about this before, he would have been the first one to veto any involvement with her, no matter how useful she could have been to their efforts. And she had been very, very useful. Without any exaggeration, she was one of the pillars of the group on which their entire plan rested. Zorian wasn't even sure if they could do this without her. Certainly, without Silver Lake, their current exit plan was completely unworkable. I have to agree with Chiron, Alanik said solemnly. Silver Lake did not keep her attitudes hidden, so this decision should not surprise anyone here. You heard what everyone said on this meeting. The Primordial offers people a guaranteed way to save their lives, as opposed to the uncertain odds of survival that we can offer her. She probably wouldn't care if every single person in Seoria ended up dead as a result of Pranaxith's release, and it might be centuries before the wide consequences of his unsealing became apparent. Plus, there is no telling what kind of prize the creature offered her to entice her further. She was also clearly already interested in primordials even before the time loop. Including Pranaxith's prison, specifically, Zorian said. She might have felt more confident about being able to come out on top when dealing with one of them. But she's immortal, right? Taven protested. Shouldn't she take the long view in this? Even if Panaxith takes several centuries to start wrecking everything, she'll still be alive by that point. You have to look at it from her eyes, Zack said. He had calmed down greatly from his initial rage, and was now thinking much more rationally about the situation. What's the alternative? Dying immediately because you couldn't get out of the time loop. That's even worse. But if Panaxith remains sealed, her original self can continue to live in peace indefinitely, Taven pointed out. She's risking the long-term future of her original in exchange for a little more life for herself. I don't think she cares about that, Zorian said, shaking his head. That Silver Lake is not her. Yes. Did you ever notice she never created any simulacrums? Even when it would have been very useful? Zack pointed out. I don't think for a moment she was unable to learn the spell. And I don't think she would sabotage our attempts to escape from the time loop by not creating more skilled manpower. I think she's one of the people who can't use them because they would freak out when they realized their lives were fleeting and do something stupid. Well, when you all put it like that, why did we ever agree to work with her in the first place? Chiron suddenly demanded, throwing his hands in the air in discontent. Yeah. One of Xvim's academic friends piped in. She was a bad idea right from the start. Whose bright idea was to include her, anyway? What was the alternative? Xvim challenged, alternating his gaze between Chiron and the other speaker. Silver Lake was brought into the group because she had critical skills that no one else possessed. The only reason we got as far as we did was because we had her working along with us. Even if she betrayed us in the end, it's hard to say whether we would have been better off without her. No one had anything to say to that. Zorian, you're the only one Panaxith told anything related to Silver Lake, Zack said. Can you tell us anything else? All he said was that someone had already taken his offer, so convincing me didn't matter anymore, Zorian said. He was the only one Panaxith had felt the need to tell that. I had no idea what that meant back then, but when I saw Silver Lake was missing. Yeah, Zack said, clacking his tongue. Doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened. So, what now? Now we have two hostile loopers to deal with once we get out of the time loop. Zorian had to admire Zack's spirit sometimes. Even now, with all their plans being thrown into total disarray, he was still confident they would get out of this alive. It was nice to have someone like that, sometimes. Panaxith's statement was a little confusing, but I think that's right. He was implying that Red Robe had also taken his offer and made a contract with him in order to leave the time loop. Presumably, this is why he spent so much time optimizing the invasion. His very life depends on its success. Presumably, once outside, Silver Lake will work with him to make sure Panaxith's release goes off as smoothly as possible. Why does Silver Lake accepting his offer mean there is no point in convincing you, though? Kale asked. You'd think Panaxith would want as many agents as possible. Probably because every time he transports someone out the gate becomes barred again, Zorian said. Remember, the whole point of gathering the key was that the gate was inexplicably barred, even though it shouldn't have been. The controller has already left, Guardian of the Threshold told us. That probably means that when Panaxith got Red Robe out of the time loop, it got stuck. The same probably happened now. Even if Panaxith wanted to transport more than one person, he couldn't. But you still have the key, Ilsa pointed out. We do, Zack confirmed. So you can probably just unbar the gate again, Ilsa stated. Probably, Zack agreed. They'd have to be pretty stupid to take any of us into the Sovereign Gate again, Alanik said pitilessly. I would never do so in their place. All of us present refused the thing's deal, Chiron pointed out, a little incensed. Or maybe we were just too slow and Silver Lake hammered out her deal before we had a chance to do the same, Xveem said. I agree with Alanik. Now that Silver Lake betrayed us, the pressure on the remaining people is all the greater. It's a pointless risk. Zorian watched the argument in silence, not knowing what to say. This was going to be a long evening. Break. After finding out what everyone had experienced in the Sovereign Gate, Zack and Zorian departed from the Nevada estate and went to ransack Silver Lake's dimensional refuge for any clues. Of course, Zorian fully intended to also steal any magical secrets or notable resources he found there. Since Silver Lake had betrayed them so utterly, he did not feel bad about robbing her blind in the slightest. Unfortunately, it seemed that Silver Lake's spite and paranoia knew no bounds. When they finally managed to subvert her defenses and break into her pocket dimension, they found it utterly wrecked. It had been reduced to a smoking crater for quite some time before they arrived, most likely because some dead man's switch had activated when she died and destroyed everything. Zorian left a couple of simulacrums to sift through the wreckage for anything of value, but he didn't have much hope they would find anything. The destruction was quite thorough. The only things that survived relatively intact was a curious arrangement of stones that was apparently responsible for powering her pocket dimension. He had long wondered how she was doing that, since the location itself could not support the dimensional magic she was using to isolate it from the rest of the world. Now he knew. Each of the heavy linking stones, which were built right into the walls of her hideout to disguise them better, had a matching counterpart deep in the underworld below her base. The underworld stones siphoned ambient mana from the dungeon and sent it straight into Silver Lake's hideout through the paired stones in the pocket dimension. He supposed that if he ever wanted to destroy Silver Lake's pocket dimension, he now knew a really easy way to do it. He just had to wreck the mana-siphoning stones in the dungeon below her sanctuary and the whole place would soon fall apart on its own. In any case, with this matter currently being dealt with, Zack and Zorian turned their attention towards the next thing that had to be done as soon as possible. They had to go back to the Sovereign Gate and talk to the Guardian of the Threshold. There was danger in doing that, of course. However, it had to be done. They had to confirm their suspicions. First, they had to see if the Guardian would still be there at all when they came back, since it had gone missing when they had last left the Sovereign Gate. Secondly, they had to see if the gate really was barred again like they suspected. If so, a lot of their speculation would be all but confirmed. Finally, they had to see if the Guardian could shed some light on what happened during their last visit. While it had seemed like nothing more than an automated puppet in the past, there was clearly something more complex going on in regards to that thing. Only the two of them would be going there this time, of course. Considering Panaxith completely ignored Zack the last time around and told Zorian he would not bother with him in the future, they probably wouldn't be seeing him on this visit. Even if they did, though, Zorian was far less afraid of him now that he knew he couldn't just reach into his head and start editing things. Whatever restrictions the Primordial was laboring under, they clearly prevented him from coercing people into anything. When they entered the Sovereign Gate, they were relieved to see the familiar figure of the Guardian of the Threshold floating in front of them. "Welcome, Controller," the Guardian greeted. "So Panaxith didn't break everything with his little visit," Zack commented, loudly exhaling in satisfaction. "That's great. Finally some good news." "Yes," Zorian agreed. He turned towards the floating humanoid of light, giving him a complex look. "What was this thing really? Guardian, is the gate still open?" They waited for several seconds, wondering why it took the Guardian so long to answer that. Usually he was really prompt with his answers, only occasionally waiting while it looked up something in the background. As the seconds ticked by, though, they realized he wasn't checking up on things before giving them an answer. Instead, The Guardian ignored Zorian's question completely. "Oh. Hey Guardian. Is the gate still open?" Zack said, repeating Zorian's question. "No, Controller. The gate is barred," the Guardian immediately answered. Zack and Zorian shared a complex look with each other. On one hand, they just confirmed their speculation about what happened. This was good. It meant they were on the right track. On the other hand, "Guardian, why did you answer his question and not mine?" Zorian asked the glowing humanoid. But the Guardian ignored his question, just like he did the previous one. In fact, Zorian realized that, although the Guardian was facing them, he was subtly tilted towards Zack. It was like he was completely ignoring Zorian's very existence. Just like he had been ignoring the temporary loopers in the past. "Guardian, why are you only responding to me and not him?" Zack asked, a bit of frustration bleeding into his voice. "I only respond to the Controller," the Guardian stated placidly. "I knew it," Zorian said quietly, followed by a small sigh. Zack stared at the Guardian, getting visibly more and more upset as time went by. Zorian just felt a sinking feeling of defeat, instead. When it rained, it poured. "This is bullshit," Zack stated angrily, pointing with his finger at Zorian. He entered this space on his own, by activating his marker. Only a controller can do that. "Yes," the Guardian agreed. "He is an anomaly. Those happen sometimes. Something or someone has managed to get past the safeguards and disrupted the integrity of the mechanism. The anomaly can access controller privileges even though he's not one. I am unable to do anything about that at the moment, but do not worry, the mistake will be corrected at the end of this cycle, when the world is recreated again." Lovely. Zorian did not need a detailed explanation to understand what the Guardian was implying. "But why now?" Zack demanded. "How did you figure out he was the anomaly all of a sudden? He had been coming and going here for ages now." "Yes. Regretful," Guardian said blandly. "However, you have presented me with the key recently, which triggered a complete analysis of the existing situation. During this inspection, the anomaly was identified and correction procedures were scheduled to be performed at the first possible opportunity." "Why?" Zack asked. "What is it about the key that triggers this?" "Activating the key signifies that something has gone wrong with the time loop mechanism," the Guardian answered, as if that was the most obvious thing in the world. "Of course a thorough check of everything is in order." "It does? You never mentioned this when we asked you about the key," Zack stated accusingly. The Guardian ignored the statement. Zorian was actually a little taken aback by this, since it meant the Guardian had probably kept them deliberately in the dark about that when they had talked to him in the past. He supposed it made sense. The key was a security measure meant to confirm the controller's identity. It made sense not to discuss the details of its operation unless the Guardian felt he had to, for some reason. "What about those privileges I claimed, then?" Zack asked. "What does that get me?" "It affirms your status as the one true controller and locks out all the other pretenders that may be working about," the Guardian said. "What?" Zack protested incredulously. "That's it? No new functions or abilities or anything like that?" "As a controller, you already have all the privileges," the Guardian told him. "You have simply ensured others do not infringe on this. Why can Zorian even access this place, then?" Zack demanded. "Hey! He is an anomaly," the Guardian said. "These privileges are such a rip-off," Zack complained. "It doesn't even do what it's supposed to properly." "I'm sorry," the Guardian said, sounding honestly apologetic. "He's a very frustrating anomaly." And thank the gods for that, Zorian thought. He wasn't panicking, strangely enough. He didn't know why. Maybe because he already faced a very dire situation today and was rather emotionally drained at the moment, but finding out he was going to be deleted at the end of the month only brought a dull mixture of dread and determination to his mind. So what if Silver Lake had betrayed them? So what if Pranaxith was actively working against him? So what if he would get erased at the end of the month? Hadn't they already planned to make an escape attempt in this restart? They just had to make sure it worked. He looked over at Zack, who had stopped arguing with the Guardian and was instead looking at Zorian like he was a dead man. A mixture of horror and guilt was etched clearly into his face. "Don't beat yourself over this," Zorian told Zack. His voice was so calm and even that even he was surprised how confident he sounded. "There was nothing else we could have done. You heard what the Guardian said. The moment we presented the key to him, I was marked for erasure. It was always a given that we would do that the moment we gathered all the pieces. We should be grateful it was so difficult and took us that long to do it, or else we would have ended up in this situation at a much earlier and far less favorable restart." "But, Zorian," Zack protested. You. This just means I need to get out of here before this month ends. It's the same situation the rest of the group is laboring under, really," Zorian said. "Don't tell me you've already given up?" "And no, Zack said slowly, taking a few deep breaths. "Damn it. I really hate this. Ask the Guardian if the key still works. Can you unbar the gate again?" He could, it turned out. "Do you want to do it now?" the Guardian asked. "No." Zack shouted at it. "No. Do nothing until I tell you, you useless thing." "As you wish," the Guardian said peacefully, completely oblivious to their emotional turmoil. There was a few seconds of silence as neither Zack nor Zorian said anything. "Well," said Zorian finally, "we should probably end this for now. We need to come here later to ask more questions, but I don't think either of us is in the right frame of mind to do so at the moment." "Yeah, I guess," Zack gloomily agreed. Suddenly, the Guardian started convulsing again. "Oh, not this shit again," Zack protested in an exasperated tone. Zorian made no moves to exit the Sovereign Gate this time. He probably couldn't even if he wanted to, but this time he actually wanted to have a talk with Pranaxith, so he didn't even try. Interestingly, Pranaxith did not bother to separate Zack from Zorian this time around and simply possessed the convulsing Guardian in front of them both. The glowing humanoid erupted into a forest of blood-red branches and tentacles before shuddering and contracting into a more human-like mass. It then quickly shapeshifted into the same female form that it had chosen for Zorian the last time they spoke. It did so far quicker than last time, apparently having gotten more proficient with the process. It took a step forward, seemingly intending to walk over to them, before pausing and stopping in place. "Hello, Zorian," Pranaxith said in a pleasant female voice. "We meet again." "I thought you said you would not bother talking to me again," Zorian immediately pointed out. "That it was a one-time offer." "Bah, I told you it was just playing hard to get," Zack stated. "Getting past the safeguards on this mechanism is not an easy thing to do," Pranaxith said. "It is not easy for me to appear before you like this. I meant what I said last time, but I decided you were more interesting than I first realized. Last time you didn't even dare show your face in front of me," Zack said loudly in a challenging tone, folding his hands over his chest. "As the controller, you are especially well protected from any tampering," Pranaxith said, shifting its attention towards Zack for a moment. "And you can leave at any time. You do not require my help, nor am I able to stop you from leaving. You are of no use to me. But here you are, showing yourself in front of me anyway," Zack pointed out. "I need to conserve my power," Pranaxith said. "Isolating you in a separate space is costly and unnecessary. I do not care if you hear us. The female form Panaxith was wearing turned its attention back to Zorian, staring at him intently. You still have a chance to survive this, Panaxith said. I have managed to stop the Guardian from rescinding all your controller privileges. Wreck the controller's mind as much as you're able, use the key to unbar the gate, and I will incarnate you in the outside world. I do not even ask that you make a contract with me. Grievously sabotaging the controller and preventing him from exiting the time loop will be payment enough for your salvation. Zack actually floated a few steps back when he heard that. You don't want me as an agent? Zorian asked, frowning. I already have 2 of them. That's more than enough, Panaxith said. If I can ensure that the controller dies here when the time loop collapses upon itself, it will be far more valuable to me than any additional number of agents. Neither Zack nor Zorian said anything for a few seconds, but Zorian was furiously thinking about things. If Panaxith was so desperate to take Zack out of the picture, that probably meant this entire time loop had been made specifically to help him find a reliable way to stop Panaxith's release. Even if Zack could not remember, so, the 2 of them were mortal enemies. Before I helped Zack gather all the pieces of the key, you were already winning, Zorian realized. You had already sent one of the temporary loopers out as your agent, and Zack had mostly forgotten his mission to stop you. He only had vague feelings to guide him in what he must do. Even if he figured out how to come here, the gate was barred and he couldn't leave. Yes. It would have been better for me if the key had never been found, Panaxith admitted readily. However, I am the very embodiment of adaptability. I do not blame you for looking out for your best interests. I simply recruited one of you as my agent, thinking that was the best way to make use of the situation. It was only later that I found out how capable you were at mind invasion, and how the original plan could still be salvaged. You didn't know that before? Zorian asked. I'm always watching, Panaxith said. Everything, everywhere. But my consciousness is a lot like yours, in that I can't pay attention to every little detail I see. When you observe an anthill, you perceive a lot, but can't you really remember what one particular ant does at any point of time? But I remember it all with perfect clarity, and I can review it all later as I wish. Just like you can remember things with perfect clarity when you want to. See? We're a lot more alike than you might think, Zorian. The female shape Panaxith was using as his avatar smiled. It was a bright, sunny smile that was probably meant to put him at ease, but which Zorian found inexplicably terrifying. We're both trapped in this cage, doing anything we can, even distasteful things, in order to get out, Panaxith continued. Do you think I want to destroy your city? Its destruction is simply an unfortunate consequence of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I never asked your kind to build a city around me. Just like you are willing to kill your outside self to live, I am willing to obliterate everything around me to get free. It is not my fault my fatality count is higher than yours. I will die if I don't get out of here in time, Zorian pointed out. You won't. The cage that binds me is torture you can barely imagine, Panaxith countered. Imagine being entombed for centuries, alive, but starving and thirsting, and unable to move a finger. If that was your fate, would you not do anything in your power to get free? That was a good argument, actually. Zorian had nothing to say to that. And then there is him, said Panaxith, suddenly pointing towards Zack. Me? Zack protested. I'm just sitting here quietly, listening to you two talk. What about me? I am heavily restricted in regards to the controller and cannot speak about things freely, but I can tell you this, no matter what you think about that person, no matter how friendly he seems, you are ultimately enemies. In the end, one has to kill the other. That's bullshit. Zack exploded. What the hell do you mean by that? He is good at pretending, Panaxith said, not even bothering to look at him. However, you should have noticed the signs by now. Don't let your emotions overpower your reason. Angry and ignored, Zack tried to ram himself into Panaxith's form, even though he knew no fighting was possible here and that this was probably a bad idea. Panaxith's form simply blurred for a moment, causing Zack to harmlessly pass through it. I have said all that needs to be said, Panaxith said. Make the right choice, Zorian. You have until the end of the restart to make a decision. I will be waiting. Then they were outside, back in their real bodies. They hadn't even activated the exit function in their marker. It was another thing that the Primordial could apparently do on its own initiative. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Zack raged, throwing around everything in the vicinity to vent his frustration. Zorian winced when one of the sensitive instruments that the facility staff used to study the Sovereign Gate impacted the nearby wall and broke apart. That was going to be a real bitch to explain to Cranton. Damn it all to hell. Why is everything suddenly going so wrong? Zack, you really need to work on your temper, Zorian said, thrusting his hand towards another device Zack just threw across the room. It immediately ceased flying through the air, stopping just before it hit one of the cabinets. Zack paced around the room angrily for a while, not saying anything but thankfully no longer destroying expensive equipment either. After a while he marched up to Zorian with heavy, purposeful steps and grasped him by the shoulders with both of his hands. Zorian, he began, you don't really believe that nonsense Panaxith was spouting there at the end, do you? Zorian stared at him, stony-faced, for several seconds. He knew that there was something to Panaxith's accusations. Zack's mind. It clearly had been tampered with somehow. Maybe by Red Robe. Maybe by the Angels, when they had given him his task. Maybe by both. Everything pointed towards that conclusion. Even if Zack was genuinely friendly and wished him nothing but good, there could be all sorts of restrictions, compulsions or contingencies placed in there, just waiting for some trigger to activate them. Perhaps once they were out of the time loop, the smiling boy in front of him would suddenly turn hostile and try to kill him for no reason. He still remembered how quickly Princess switched from seeing them as mortal enemies to following one of them like an overgrown puppy, just because they managed to scratch her a little with her control dagger. However, he also knew it would be a mistake to say that out loud. For one thing, Zack just listened to Panaxith telling Zorian to scramble his mind in exchange for a ticket to outside. In light of that, any argument Zorian might use to convince Zack to let him rummage inside his mind would seem very suspect. No, Zorian said. I don't believe that at all. Zack stared at him for a second before finally letting go of his shoulders and straightening himself a little. Good, he said, patting Zorian on the shoulder in a friendly manner. That's good. We can't let that thing divide us like that. We need to trust each other, now most of all. Right, Zorian said. He actually agreed with that. And by the way, you're the one explaining to Cranton why you totally trashed the room like that. Zack froze for a second and then looked around him, assessing damage. I guess you're right, he said with a groan. I really do need to work on my temper.